The cabin had always been a sanctuary. It wasn't large or flashy, and it certainly didn't boast the manicured lawns or polished aesthetics that the suburban HOA demanded of its members. But it was mine. Tucked away at the end of a winding, gravel road, the cabin stood as a quiet retreat, wrapped in the silence of tall pines and the whispers of a nearby creek. For years, I had enjoyed its peace without much interference from the neighbors, occasionally nodding at them at the community meetings, but otherwise keeping to myself. The HOA board, however, had other ideas. Their obsession with control was notorious. They prided themselves on appearances, dictating everything from the color of mailboxes to the type of holiday decorations residents were allowed to display. What started as mild annoyance over their endless reminders and notices escalated into a constant tug-of-war, with me resisting their overreach whenever possible. My cabin was rustic by design, and I intended to keep it that way. No white fences, no sterile landscaping, no polished siding that gleamed under the sun. Just wood, stone, and nature. At first, their disapproval was delivered through letters slipped under my door. Your property does not meet community standards. Exterior maintenance required. Violation notice, landscaping not compliant. I filed them away, knowing they had no real authority over how I chose to keep my home. But the HOA didn't like being ignored. What they couldn't demand outright, they tried to enforce through intimidation and manipulation. Their meetings became battlegrounds, with my cabin always a topic of complaint. It wasn't until early spring that their meddling reached an entirely new level. A neighbor sent me a photo message one morning showing a car parked at my gate. A clean, expensive sedan, its rear bumper decorated with a glossy magnetic sign advertising a local real estate company. The neighbor's message was simple. "Looks like your place is up for sale?" The words stopped me cold. My cabin wasn't for sale. It had never been for sale. And yet, when I drove down to check, I saw it myself. A realtor standing just beyond my property line, phone in hand, snapping photos of the house through the trees as though preparing a listing. The audacity of it was staggering. After approaching the gate and confronting the situation, I pieced the story together. The realtor had been invited by the HOA. They told her the property was available, that it was falling into disrepair, and that they wanted her to evaluate it for a potential sale. To them, my home wasn't a personal sanctuary or a piece of land I cherished. It was an eyesore they wanted removed, a blemish on the carefully curated image of their neighborhood. And now they had crossed into dangerous territory by trying to push me out without my knowledge. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, but I didn't lash out. Instead, I stood quietly at the gate, staring at the lock and chain I had placed there months earlier. My property, my boundaries, my rules. If the HOA wanted a fight, then it was time I gave them one. That night, I walked the perimeter of the land with a flashlight, checking every corner of the fence. The woods pressed in around me, thick and shadowy, but I welcomed their presence. The cabin was not just a home, it was a fortress now. The next morning, I printed a sign on bright, bold paper, laminated it, and posted it directly on the gate. It read, "Private property, not for sale, no trespassing." The act wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. A statement visible to anyone driving by that I would not bow to the HOA's schemes. And in a way, it felt satisfying, almost cathartic, as though I had drawn a line they could no longer ignore. But the move wasn't without consequences. Within hours, whispers spread through the neighborhood. Residents slowed as they drove past, gawking at the bold letters displayed on my gate. Some smirked, others scowled, but all of them noticed. And by the end of the week, the HOA president herself stood outside the fence, clipboard in hand, her narrowed eyes reading the sign again and again as if trying to decipher the audacity behind it. What started as a private property dispute was quickly spiraling into a spectacle. The HOA had made their move by inviting the Realtor. Now I had countered with a public declaration of defiance. The tension between us thickened, invisible but undeniable, like a storm gathering in the distance. And though I didn't yet realize this was only the beginning, because the HOA wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. The morning after the sign went up, the atmosphere around the neighborhood shifted. What had once been quiet waves from passing cars turned into long, uncomfortable stares. Neighbors slowed down as they passed my driveway, some whispering into their phones, others snapping discreet photos of the bold red letters declaring my property not for sale. It was clear the HOA had already spun their version of events, painting me as the problem, the stubborn holdout who refused to cooperate with community improvement. By midweek, an official envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's emblem like some royal decree. Inside was a letter filled with vague threats and exaggerated claims. According to them, my cabin was creating a perception of neglect, lowering community values, and inviting safety concerns. They cited no laws, no ordinances, only their obsession with appearances. The letter ended with a sentence that made my blood boil. Failure to comply will result in further action deemed necessary by the board. I tucked the paper into a drawer and walked outside. The gate stood strong, the lock glinting in the sunlight, and the sign hung defiantly in place. I knew their further action wouldn't be as straightforward as another letter. The HOA liked to operate in the shadows, using intimidation, peer pressure, and manipulation to wear people down. But I wasn't interested in wearing down. I was interested in pushing back harder. That weekend, I added a new layer of defense. I reinforced the gate with a heavier chain, checked the fencing for weak spots, and installed a small motion-activated camera at the entrance. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Because the more I thought about the Realtor's sudden visit, the more it became obvious that the HOA was testing boundaries. They wanted to see how far they could push. If I didn't set mine firmly, they would keep advancing until my cabin was nothing but a memory. Sure enough, their next move came faster than I expected. On a warm Saturday afternoon, a car pulled into the gravel shoulder near my property. A family stepped out, 2 adults and a child, clutching brochures and scanning the land with curious eyes. They walked toward the gate, chatting excitedly, until they noticed the large private property sign. Their smiles faltered. The father squinted at it, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Within minutes, they were back in their car, pulling, away with confusion written across their faces. I didn't need to guess who had sent them. The HOA had advertised my cabin as up for sale, without my knowledge or consent. They were actively inviting potential buyers to tour land that wasn't even on the market. The sheer audacity of it made my hands tighten into fists. Not only were they trespassing against my rights, but they were dragging strangers into the mess as pawns in their scheme. The camera at the gate confirmed it all later that night. Clear footage of the family approaching, stopping at the sign, and leaving. Evidence. Proof that the HOA was spreading false claims and staging visits as if my property was their chessboard to move pieces around on. Rather than anger, a cold determination settled over me. If they wanted to play this game, I would play it better. I printed a second sign, this one larger and even more direct. Property not for sale. Trespassers will be reported. I mounted it next to the first, ensuring there could be no misunderstanding. And this time, I angled the camera directly at the road, so every vehicle that slowed or stopped would be recorded. The signs had their intended effect. Within days, the neighborhood buzz grew louder. Rumors spread that I was unstable, hostile, even dangerous. The HOA president was spotted whispering to neighbors on evening walks, shaking her head as if deeply troubled by my behavior. But I didn't care about their whisper campaign. What mattered was that the line had been drawn, visible, and undeniable. My land was mine, and anyone who crossed it would face consequences. Still, I knew the HOA wasn't finished. For them, this wasn't just about a cabin, it was about control. They couldn't tolerate someone standing outside their reach, someone who rejected their authority outright. To the HOA, my locked gate and bold signs weren't just eyesores, they were acts of rebellion. And if there's one thing HOAs despise, more than anything, it's a resident who refuses to bend. Late one evening, as the last light of day slipped behind the trees, I heard it. A slow crunch of gravel, the sound of tires inching up the road. I stepped onto the porch, silent, and watched a dark SUV pause just beyond the gate. The headlights flickered off. For a long moment, it sat there, idling. Then, without warning, it reversed back down the road and disappeared into the night. It wasn't the first car to stop, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about that moment felt different. Less curious, more calculated. As though someone was measuring, waiting, planning their next move. And I realized, standing there in the dark, that this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a battle of endurance. And the HOA had just revealed how far they were willing to go. The SUV that lingered at the gate was a turning point. Up until then, the HOA's tactics had been brazen but predictable. Letters, false claims, and phony buyers showing up to peek through the trees. But the late-night visit carried a different weight. It wasn't just about appearances anymore. It felt like surveillance, as if they were studying me, waiting for me to slip, eager to collect evidence to twist against me. The very next morning, the HOA made their next move. A certified letter arrived, its envelope stiff and imposing, with bold print demanding signature upon delivery. Inside was a formal notice of violation, accompanied by a list of grievances, each more absurd than the last. My cabin was described as a blight, my natural landscaping deemed hazardous, and the locked gate labeled a deterrent to emergency access. They even claimed my signs were aggressive and in violation of community standards. None of it carried legal weight. I knew that. Their rules were little more than suggestions wrapped in self-importance, enforceable only if I let them bully me into compliance. Still, the tone of the letter revealed their strategy. They were building a paper trail. Every accusation, every claim, every embellished complaint was a brick in the wall they hoped to construct against me. I wasn't naive. I knew how HOAs operated. They relied on fear, banking on the assumption that residents would give up before. The fight escalated, but I had no intention of rolling over. I made copies of every letter, stored footage from the camera, and documented everything, from the Realtor's unauthorized visit to the strangers who approached the gate. If they wanted a battle of paperwork, I would arm myself with proof. Days that followed brought more hostility, this time in subtler forms. Trash appeared at the edge of my property line, left deliberately where it would be noticed. A broken bottle one morning, an empty fast food bag the next. At first, I wondered if it was coincidence, passing drivers tossing litter. But the pattern was too deliberate, too targeted. It was harassment, and it was meant to send a message. You don't belong here. Even the neighbors who once waved politely now avoided eye contact. Some crossed the street when walking past, as though proximity to my cabin might somehow taint them in the eyes of the HOA. The president's campaign of whispers was working, isolating me from the community piece by piece. She didn't need to prove I was in violation. She just needed everyone else to believe I was a problem. Then came the most brazen stunt yet. One weekday afternoon, I returned from town to find a bright orange notice stapled to a wooden post just outside my gate. At first glance, it looked official. Large block letters, legal-sounding jargon, and the word condemned scrawled across the top in red. But upon closer inspection, it was nothing more than a forgery, crafted to look like a government order, but signed only with the initials of the HOA. The message was clear. They wanted me gone, and they weren't above fabricating authority to achieve it. The sight of that fake condemnation notice hanging there for every passerby to see filled me with a fury I could barely contain. They weren't just meddling now, they were slandering, manufacturing lies to destroy my credibility. I ripped the paper down, kept it as evidence, and replaced it with something of my own. A third sign, larger and harsher than the rest: Chow has no authority here. Trespassers will be prosecuted. I knew it would fuel their anger, but that was the point. I wasn't interested in quiet compliance. I wanted them to know I saw through every trick, every scheme, and I wasn't backing down. That night, I sat on the porch as the crickets hummed in the trees, watching the glow of headlights sweep past, on the road. A few slowed as they reached the gate, lingering for a moment before moving on. The air was heavy, the silence tense, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I realized then that this was no longer a petty dispute over aesthetics. This had become a war of endurance, a test of who could outlast the other. And, beneath the surface, something darker was growing. Each new tactic from the HOA felt more desperate, more reckless. They had already lied to realtors, forged notices, and stirred up hostility among neighbors. What would stop them from pushing further? If appearances were their obsession, then I had become their greatest threat, the crack in their polished facade. I didn't know exactly what their next move would be, but I felt it building, pressing, closer with each passing day. The SUV at night, the fake notices, the whispers, they weren't the climax. They were the build-up, the tightening of a noose they thought I wouldn't notice. But I noticed, and I was ready. The forged condemnation notice marked a shift in tone. Until then, the HOA's schemes had been laughable in their desperation. Petty letters, gossip campaigns, and staged showings with unsuspecting strangers. But with that stunt, they crossed into dangerous territory, willing to impersonate authority to further their agenda. And as I soon discovered, it was only the beginning. A week later, I was woken by a loud knock at my door. When I opened it, a county inspector stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, his truck idling in the driveway. The HOA had filed an official complaint. They accused me of harboring unsafe living conditions, improper waste disposal, and structural neglect. According to the paperwork he carried, they had requested a full evaluation of my property. The inspector was polite, even apologetic, but the implication was clear. The HOA had weaponized bureaucracy. They couldn't enforce laws themselves, so they had turned to outside authorities, hoping to find a technicality that would force me out. For the first time, the battle that had once felt like neighborhood squabbling had become a fight involving government channels. I allowed the inspector to walk the perimeter, confident in my preparations. The cabin was old but well-maintained. The septic system functioned properly, the roof was sound, and the fencing was secure. He jotted notes, asked a few questions, and eventually shook his head. There was nothing of concern, nothing that would justify action. As he drove away, relief mingled with anger. The HOA had failed this round, but they had tested new ground, and I had no illusions they would stop there. Sure enough, within days, the harassment escalated. Strange vehicles appeared. More frequently, sometimes idling by the gate, sometimes turning slowly into the drive before backing out. Flyers began showing up in neighborhood mailboxes, each one anonymous but dripping with the same venomous tone. Warnings about declining property values, urging residents to take a stand against negligence. The finger pointed squarely at me. The most chilling moment came one evening as I checked the gate before bed. My signs were still intact, but a fresh message had been scrawled in thick black marker across the wooden post that held them. 4 words: "You will lose." It was no longer subtle. They had abandoned the pretense of civility and resorted to intimidation. For a moment, I considered calling the police, reporting the harassment, even pursuing legal action against the board. But deep down, I knew what would happen. The HOA thrived on dragging disputes into endless legal mud, draining time and energy until their target gave up. They wanted me to react, to panic, to surrender the land they coveted. Instead, I doubled down. I reinforced the gate again, added a second camera at a higher angle, and saved every shred of evidence in a locked box inside the cabin. If they wanted war, I would fight it on my terms, not with fear, but with preparation. The tension reached a fever pitch when a notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board at the community entrance. I didn't see it firsthand, but a sympathetic neighbor quietly sent me a photo. In bold letters, the board had announced a special community meeting to discuss solutions to the ongoing issue of non-compliance at the North property. They never named me, but they didn't need to. Everyone knew the cabin on the north end of the neighborhood. Everyone knew who the issue was. That meeting was their battleground, their chance to rally the community against me in full view. And I could picture it perfectly. The president standing tall, painting me as the villain, while neighbors nodded along, believing every word. The idea of being publicly cornered, reduced to a caricature of their lies, burned inside me. But I also knew something they didn't. My cameras had been rolling for weeks, collecting evidence of every staged stunt, every unwanted visitor, every vehicle that slowed at the gate. When the night of the meeting came, I didn't attend. I stayed home, lights dim, watching from the porch as clusters of cars disappeared toward the community center. The air was thick with anticipation, though no words were spoken. Somewhere not far from where I sat, my name was being dragged across, a stage of self-righteous anger. But the difference was this time, I had proof. By the time the meeting ended, the neighborhood felt heavier, colder. Cars returned slowly, headlights sweeping through the dark, and I could sense the outcome without hearing a single word. The HOA had sharpened their blades, and the community had swallowed the story whole. But if they believed I was isolated, defenseless, and cornered, they were wrong. What they didn't know was that every smear campaign, every act of trespass, every false claim had been captured, logged, and preserved. And when the time came, I would use it all. The war with the HOA was no longer about aesthetics or property value or appearances. It was about survival. Who would outlast the other? And I wasn't planning to lose. The meeting had emboldened them. In the days that followed, the hostility shifted from whispers and paperwork to something far more aggressive. The HOA no longer hid behind letters or anonymous flyers. Their disdain manifested in bold, physical acts meant to intimidate, acts that crossed the line from nuisance into outright sabotage. The first sign came with the gate. I woke one morning to find the lock cut clean through, the heavy chain tossed into the ditch like trash. Whoever had done it hadn't tried to conceal their actions. They wanted me to see, to know that barriers meant nothing to them. I replaced the chain with a thicker one, secured it with a reinforced lock, and installed another hidden camera aimed directly at the gate post. If they tried again, I would have footage. But the vandalism didn't stop there. A week later, I returned from town to find the side of the cabin streaked with paint, thick, oily splatters of white across the wood siding, dripping down like scars. The mess wasn't random. It was targeted, deliberately placed to cause maximum damage. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, proof that the vandals had acted recently, brazenly. As I scrubbed the stains, anger boiled inside me. The HOA had escalated into open sabotage, and they were confident I would do nothing. They believed I was alone, powerless, too small to stand against their united front. But they underestimated one thing. I was documenting every step, every violation, every malicious act. Their arrogance was digging them deeper into a pit of their own making. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. Strange noises echoed at night. Footsteps on gravel, the crack of branches snapping under weight, the faint hum of engines idling just out of sight. They were circling, testing boundaries, trying to rattle me into making a mistake. But instead of fear, the constant harassment only sharpened my resolve. Then came the boldest stunt yet. Late one afternoon, I discovered a fresh "for sale" sign hammered into the ground just outside my property line. This one wasn't subtle. It bore the name of a local real estate company, the same one that had sent the Realtor weeks earlier. But when I called, the company was baffled. They had no listing for my property, no record of involvement, and no idea how their name had been dragged back into the mess. The HOA had fabricated the sign, hoping to legitimize their narrative and confuse anyone who passed by. I pulled the sign up, dragged it to the porch, and set it against the wall as yet another piece of evidence. The brazenness of it all was staggering. They weren't just trying to pressure me anymore. They were rewriting reality, constructing a false version of events in which my cabin was already theirs to dispose of. But the final blow of that week came under cover of night. Around midnight, the motion camera alerted me to movement at the gate. When I checked the footage, I saw two figures crouched low, their faces obscured by hoodies. They worked quickly, tampering with the post, attempting to pry it loose from the ground. After several minutes, they abandoned the effort and disappeared into the dark. The gate held firm, but the message was undeniable. They weren't afraid to trespass, and they were growing bolder. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't about appearances anymore. It wasn't about community standards or property values. This had become personal. The HOA, furious at my defiance, was determined to break me by any means necessary. If intimidation didn't work, they would escalate until something gave, but I wasn't about to give. Instead, I doubled my preparations. I reinforced the fencing, upgraded the cameras, and even posted copies of the forged condemnation notice and fake "for sale" sign in clear view on the gate, my way of exposing their lies to anyone who cared to see. If they wanted a war of appearances, I would turn their own weapons against them. The neighborhood, once quiet, now simmered with tension. I could feel the stares when I drove through town, hear the murmurs as neighbors crossed paths on the street. Some avoided me entirely, but others watched with thinly veiled curiosity, waiting to see how far the battle would go. The HOA had cast me as the villain, but deep down, I wondered how many of them secretly doubted the board's narrative, how many saw through the charade. As summer edged closer, the air grew heavy with more than just heat. Every day carried the sense of something looming, an inevitable clash that neither side could avoid. The HOA had escalated to sabotage, and I had answered with defiance. The conflict had reached its breaking point, and standing on the porch one evening, watching the sunset bleed across the treetops, I knew the final confrontation was near. They had played their hand, and I had played mine. The only question left was who would outlast the other when the storm finally broke. By the time midsummer arrived, the neighborhood no longer felt like a community. It felt like a battlefield. The HOA had exhausted their usual arsenal of letters, fabricated notices, and whispered campaigns. Their sabotage had grown bolder. Cut, locks, painted siding, fake signs hammered into the earth. And yet, despite every attempt, my cabin still stood. The gate was locked, the signs were clear, and I remained unmoved. But the board was not finished. If anything, their failures had only sharpened their determination. I could feel it in the air, like static before a storm, the sense that something larger was coming. And it came, not with stealth or subtlety, but with a spectacle designed to humiliate. On a humid Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of engines. Multiple vehicles, heavy tires grinding against gravel, voices carrying through the trees. When I stepped outside, I saw them, a convoy of cars parked along the road, blocking both directions. At the center was the HOA president, clipboard in hand, flanked by board members and a few neighbors who had thrown in their allegiance. Behind them stood two men in work vests, each carrying tools. They had staged an inspection. Without notice, without consent, they were attempting to force their way onto the property. Their pretense was thin. They muttered about safety, hazards, and community enforcement. But their true intent was obvious. They were trying to make a show of power, to prove to everyone watching that the HOA's word was final. But they hadn't expected resistance. The moment they reached the gate, the cameras activated, recording every movement, every word. The president tugged at the chain, scowled at the locks, and gestured for the workers to proceed. But as they rattled the post and tried to lift it from the ground, I appeared at the edge of the porch, holding my phone. With one tap, I uploaded the footage to the cloud, backing it up instantly. Then I began live streaming, broadcasting the HOA's intrusion to anyone willing to watch. The effect was immediate. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the cameras and whispering among themselves. Others stepped back entirely, unwilling to be part of something that now had a permanent digital record. The president, however, doubled down, her face flushed with determination. She barked orders, insisting the workers continue, but hesitation had already crept into their movements. And then came the sound of another engine, this time from behind. A county sheriff's vehicle pulled up, lights flashing, gravel scattering under its tires. The HOA president froze, clipboard trembling in her grip. The timing wasn't coincidence. I had prepared for this moment, saving every shred of evidence, every video, every forged notice, and when the harassment escalated beyond repair, I filed a formal complaint. The sheriff had been expecting trouble, and trouble had arrived right on cue. The scene unraveled quickly. The officers stepped out, listened calmly, as the HOA president sputtered about community standards and eyesores, then turned to me for my side. I didn't need speeches or emotion. I simply handed them a folder, copies of the letters, the fake condemnation notice, still images of strangers sent to tour the property, and footage of vandalism caught on camera. It was all there, a timeline of harassment too detailed to dismiss. Silence followed as the officers flipped through the pages, their expressions tightening with each example. Finally, they turned back to the president and her board, their tone sharp and unyielding. What had begun as a spectacle of dominance had flipped into a scene of accountability. The HOA, once so confident in its power, now stood exposed, caught in its own web of lies and intimidation. One by one, the crowd dispersed. Neighbors slipped back into their cars, unwilling to attach themselves to the fallout. The workers set down their tools and left quietly, refusing to be pawns in the board's vendetta. And the president, red-faced and trembling, was escorted away by the officers for questioning. Her clipboard, once a symbol of authority, dangled uselessly at her side. The road cleared, the convoy vanished, and the cabin was silent once more. I stood at the gate looking out at the empty stretch of gravel, and for the first time in months, the tension lifted. The HOA had thrown everything they had at me: letters, lies, sabotage, intimidation, and I had endured. Not by shouting louder, not by bending to their will, but by standing firm, documenting and refusing to yield. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood adjusted. The president resigned quietly, her reputation shattered. The board scrambled to rebuild credibility, toning down their rhetoric and steering clear of my property. Neighbors who once glared now avoided eye contact entirely, some even offering awkward nods as if to distance themselves from the drama they had once fueled. And the cabin remained, unchanged, standing as it always had. The signs still hung on. The gate, bold reminders of the line that had been drawn. The cameras stayed in place, not as a symbol of paranoia, but of vigilance. The war with the HOA had ended not with their victory, but with their defeat, and the lesson lingered like a warning carved into the wood of the cabin itself. When you stand your ground, when you refuse to surrender what is yours, even the most controlling forces eventually collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The HOA had tried to sell my home, claim it, erase it. Instead, they exposed themselves, leaving me with the one thing they could never take: peace of mind. The cabin, my cabin, was never for sale, and now it never would be.